in trips, there is nothing better than Flyingbound's laboratory. Newsflash. An explosion at a dairy college took place this afternoon. Is believed to be due to a gas leak. 4 people are reportedly dead.
I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, thou desirest truth in the inner parts, and in the hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom.
Hey, how can I help you?
I'll have a green tea, please.
Sure.
Thanks.
If you're going to Cousin Town, you should take the shortcut. It's just first exit up I-95. Once you see the Black House, hang a left, you'll be there in no time.
Breaking news just in. The Shawshank prisoner escaped this morning. Many with the help of others. We advise all citizens to remain vigilant.
Welcome to the Running Man! Tonight, he's in Harding. Tomorrow, in New York, Boise, Albuquerque, Columbus, skulking outside your home. Will you report him?
Cujo?
How many times do I have to tell you you're gonna fry your brain using that thing?
Have you seen the Reverend George Winston lately?
Ever since his wife died, he hasn't been the same. I heard he stayed with the body for 5 days before calling a mortician.
Frucci,
Oh, have a lucky devil. Did you hear Brenda won $2,700 last time she played? And, give me an American grain.
Thanks, Richie. Say hi to Miss Sidley for me, will you?
Will do, Billy Wilmington.
Hi, Nona. How can I help you?
It escaped again.
I hope it behaved well.
Picture perfect.
Nice. Did you take the shortcut? You've done well. Take it to the master. He's in the back.
Everybody who hasn't read a Stephen King book has still seen a Stephen King movie.
The Stand or The Dead Zone or Cujo or Shawshank Redemption, Green Mile, all the Frank Darabont ones, all the Rob Reiner ones.
Stand By Me I thought was terrific.
Christine was such a good film, and Carrie was such a good film.
It completely traumatized me.
Cast Iron and Silver Bullet are two of my very favorites. I adored them.
Creepshow had a massive impact, and it's unique and it's stylized.
George Claiborne was really good.
In 1408, it's just such a descent into madness that in that movie, almost anything could happen at any moment.
Nick Jarrett did The Stand.
Misery is one of my favorites.
Pet Sematary is a great movie. I love what he does with Karen.
The Dark Half obviously was one that was successful.
Shining is pretty hard to get past, let's face it.
A lot of people came to his work because of the movies. They probably started with the movies and then discovered the books.
It all started with Carrie.
It was the movie that really brought a lot of attention to Steve's work.
You couldn't miss Carrie, which I remember seeing the movie before I had read the book.
The book was not well known until De Palma's movie came out, and the movie blew me away. It was so great.
I think that's the first time I became aware of who he was, back in 1976. I was just struck by the story.
This character's journey and like what she's going through with her mom and the bullying at school, and then the powers that she gets and how it kind of works as a metaphor for her entrance into womanhood. It really does that perfectly.
Watching the whole transition of Carrie, you know, just it's like Jekyll and Hyde. King seemed to really kind of bring that in there too, that ability people have to just have this metamorphosis into something that just wants to harm you.
From the way Brian De Palma uses the split screen in the prom, to the car flipping over and they're trying to run her down the road, to the whole ending sequence with the mom in the house getting kind of crucified to the door and the knife thrown in her, to that final jump scare moment, you know, which shows that like jump scare isn't always a dirty word.
Carrie wasn't really scary. You just seeing her burn everything down at the end. You're watching it and it's thrilling. I think it's more of a thriller than a horror picture.
To me, as in much of Stephen King's work, Carrie is not just a horror film. It's come to be a horror film because of the way that it was first treated. But the way it's written, it sort of has a string going through Stephen King's work.
When folks hear Stephen King, most of the time, especially those who aren't like super accustomed or knowledgeable of his work, they think, oh, the horror guy, which is not true.
Stephen King writes human beings, and then he puts them in incredibly pressured, difficult, sometimes phantasmagorical situations.
You know, you're dealing with characters who are just so interesting and so fascinating. Like, he really knows how to explore it through characters that you give a shit about.
Much of Stephen King's work seems to be about how we treat each other.
There was no real horror genre in movies until Psycho.
Psycho brought that open, and then there were a huge number of people who followed it.
You know, we went through the 50s where we had great sci-fi horror movies that were all about the strangeness of things that can happen to us. The horror that existed in the story was really all about, oh, that's a great monster, or that's a scary situation. When Steve came along in the 70s, it was all about how people were affected by what happened. And I think that he's changed horror and genre movie making just by that alone.
He made it real for so many people because he put brand names in. All of a sudden you had people eating food that you ate or using detergent that you used in your dishwasher. It became very American and very recognizable, and he also spread the word to a huge swath of the American public. You could say to the middle class.
And doing it in a way that is without pretense, that speaks to the common people, is for and about the common people.
He loves common people. He loves folksy people. And he's got that dialogue down pat. He doesn't condescend to them. He doesn't condescend to middle Americans. And I think that's important. In many ways, he is a man of the people.
Instead of setting everything in big cities, he chooses locations and environments that are identifiable for everybody. You could make Maine Pennsylvania. You could make Maine the countryside of France. You could make Maine a lot of different places, because we all have places like that. We all have small towns and communities, and it allows the people and the characters to emerge as opposed to being overwhelmed by, say, a New York City environment. Stephen King's identity is wrapped up in almost small town horror.
It's much more relatable than, Castle in Transylvania. That's not what he does. That can be scary too, but that's not what he does. And I think the thing about these small American towns is so interesting because it's not what you expect.
I think he is so deeply an American writer and writing about America and the darkness that lurks within the heart of America.
He just has that gift to kind of tap into what we all can relate to and connect to, and it always feels sort of present time, even if it's a period thing. It always feels like America.
Is very kind of Norman Rockwell Americana. It's an idealized America, but then it's ripped apart and sent to hell.
It completely traumatized me. My parents had refused to let me watch the miniseries, and so I would watch it at a friend's house when I was way too young, really, to discover Stephen King.
Hi, Ben! Want a balloon, Ben?
It was all over the airwaves in Australia when it first came out, and that just terrified me. Me and my friends, we had a video camera, we'd recreate scenes from it. It was just an obsession.
One of the first movies that I ever made with my friends in the backyard was an adaptation of It, actually, when I was in 7th grade. Horror movies in particular were always kind of what I was drawn to and terrified of as a viewer.
When Tim Curry first appears down in the train,
aren't you going to say
as
hello?
11-year-old boy, there was nothing more terrifying.
Oh, come on, bucko. Don't you want a balloon?
Tim Curry's performance as Pennywise is the ultimate terrifying performance because he plays it like a clown. He doesn't play it like a monster. He plays it like a birthday clown. And that is so terrifying to me. I do have, to this day, a fear of clowns, and Tim Curry in It is the reason for that.
Basically, every time Pennywise appears in that movie, it is truly terrifying to a kid.
I was so traumatized by trying to watch horror films, but so interested in horror that I decided to switch over to books. And the very first book I picked up when I was like 10 years old was It. And that was a huge mistake. I found myself in this really intense, conflicted situation where I didn't want to keep reading because I was so frightened and because I was having horrible nightmares. But I cared so much about the Losers Club. I cared so much about these beautifully rendered characters that I had to keep reading.
It's basically piss and shit, so I'm just telling you.
By the end of it, I realized that he had created an opportunity for me to learn how to be braver in very small increments, just to finish a chapter or eventually to finish the book. And that became a muscle that I would try to exercise as I got older. And what I think really horror is all about, it's exercise for courage in the same way that we'd go to the gym to try to get stronger physically. Horror movies and horror stories can help us practice being brave for a very short amount of time in a completely safe space. That journey started with it for me, but carried me very quickly through all of the available works by Stephen King, and he almost immediately became my hero.
When I hear stories about other people talking about their first encounter with Stephen King, it was usually in childhood. Certain works of art that you experience as a child imprint on you in a way that I don't think they can when you're an adult. And I am of a very particular generation, that first generation of kids that were exposed to Stephen King. And it unquestionably left an indelible mark.
Early 1980s, my dad had a giant library in our house. And on the very bottom shelf, he had a couple Stephen King books. He had the paperbacks of Carrie. He had the Salem's Lot paperback that had pictures from the Tobe Hooper miniseries in the middle, so you could see Barlow, like right before he was gonna get staked. And so I knew the logo for Stephen King's name on books before I could even read. Stephen King was a big part of my childhood, and I think a lot of people's childhoods in the 1980s and the 1990s. I think kids flocked to Stephen King because he wrote true, authentic teenage characters and kid characters. And if he got you when you were young, he had you for life.
He rocks in the treetop all the day long, hopping and a bopping and a singing his song. All the little birds on Jaybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, 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 rockin' robin.
One of the other ones that really had an impact on me was Stand By Me. When I first saw it, I didn't connect to Stephen King. I thought it was a wonderful drama about coming of age. And at the end of the film, when Stephen King's name came up, I remember being shocked that someone who I associated so much with horror was capable of creating something so beautiful.
Stand By Me I grew up with. My best friend and I would leave our homes to go try to go on a journey to find a dead body and try to find train tracks, and we'd go down ditches all day and be like, we're gonna go find a body. And we wished we were in that movie. So that was really a touchstone movie that, to me, when I think about Stephen King, I don't ever think about horror. I always think about how I felt when I read it or the feelings it gave me and the characters. And when I think of my favorite Stephen King movies, I think of Stand By Me and The Shawshank Redemption.
I remember seeing Stand By Me and was just so taken with it. I just loved it so much. In fact, it's because of Stand By Me that I took Shawshank, the script, to Castle Rock. Because of Stand By Me, I felt that Castle Rock would really understand the movie I was trying to make. And happily, that's exactly what happened. I remember, in fact, being on the set of Nightmare on Elm Street 3 one night, going, should I ask Steve for the rights to Shawshank or The Mist? I finally went for Shawshank because it was so character-based, and Stephen King said yes.
Shawshank is different. That's about redemption. That's about humanity. That's about a man falsely imprisoned and trying to learn how to deal with it and not go crazy. It's what it makes you feel for the people. It's the heart that it has in it.
You immediately fall in love with Red. He's just this awesome character that you would love just to listen to and watch for the entirety of the film. And of course, the main character, Andy, as well.
As much as The Shining means to horror fans, The Shawshank Redemption means a lot to fans that are looking for some kind of hope in the world, that their lives can improve no matter how bad they get.
Well, it took 5 years for me to actually get around to writing the script. After Steve gave me the rights, I know I had a certain ambition for the creative aspect of what I wanted that script to be, and I didn't think I was a good enough writer yet. It's another thing I have to thank Stephen King for, his patience. every once in a while I would let him know that I still wanted to do it. And finally one day I felt ready and I wrote it in 8 weeks, sent it to Castle Rock. Castle Rock came back to me. Liz Glotzer, who was one of their key development executives, she's the first one who read the script there and walked into her boss's office and said, "We have to make this movie." She slapped it down on the desk and said, "If we don't make this, I quit." So Liz called me and said, "Rob Reiner read the script and really loves it." There was a moment when Rob expressed interest in directing it himself. In fact, Tom Cruise had read the script and asked Rob if Rob wanted to direct it. And with Tom in it, then Rob said, "Oh, let's offer Frank a writing position. Let's offer him a lot of money." I thought about it for a day, you know? But then I called them back and I said, you know what? I want to stick with it. I want to direct it myself because I really feel this deep in my marrow. I feel this story very deeply. And if not this, then what? And if not now, then when? When am I going to direct a movie that matters to me? If you're remembered for anything, it's for the kindness you show or the art you create. You're not remembered for your bank account. Nobody's impressed by that. Nobody cares. So, yeah, it was a very handsome offer, but it was money. It was just money. And Rob was such a sweetheart and such a supporter and a booster and a mentor. He took no for an answer very graciously and gracefully.
Frank is one of the most consummate directors I've ever worked with. He loves movies more than anything in the world. Him and Quentin Tarantino probably, I don't know who loves movies more. Frank really loves it. He agonizes over every single detail, and it shows in his movies. I mean, Shawshank Redemption is probably one of the greatest American-made movies of our generation.
And my memory is that wasn't a success, but has grown into people thinking it's one of the best movies ever.
It's set in prison. It doesn't have Sylvester Stallone or Van Damme in it. You know, it's not an action movie. Clearly, it's a drama with Morgan and Tim. It looks like a depressing movie. You know, there's no way you can cut the trailer together and convince the audience that it's going to be something they love for years to come. So we had trouble getting people to show up, and that was very, very disappointing, I have to admit. Shortly thereafter, think Academy. They nominated us for 7 Academy Awards, and we were one of the 5 Best Picture nominees that year.
The Shawshank Redemption, Nicky Marvin, producer. And the Oscar goes to...
We didn't win a single award. It was Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump's year. They swept everything. It's a great movie, so I'm not surprised. It was that and Pulp Fiction and 4 Weddings and a Funeral and Quiz Show. And Shawshank. And everybody's, what is Shawshank? I remember even being at the awards, and when Shawshank was announced, people who were there would go, what? What movie? Did we miss this? So it so brought attention to the film in a way that we could not have purchased by marketing or advertising. That'll be one of those movies that people hold on to, it seems. And I'm so grateful for that.
I think Stephen King likes those contained situations where people are stuck in one specific arena. It's almost like a theater play. From the situations comes a lot of challenging moments between characters because they're forced to challenge themselves and challenge others. That's the theme, obviously, in The Mist and The Shining and Fortin Way. And the psychology in these contained areas is interesting, and a lot of things are happening. A lot of things are coming out because we got stuck. That's a situation that King likes to put his character in, and as we can now, what we have learned collectively from month of lockdown is a challenging situation.
The device he uses, being inside with nowhere to go, he wants you to focus on what's happening, not on what's happening outside in the world. And in that environment, there's no escape. You really have to face your demons.
I'm here because island folk know how to pull together for the common good when they need to.
And that's what these people did, trapped on Little Tall in Storm of the Century. Now, in the case of Rose Red, I think it's the same thing. They were trapped within this controlled environment where the house was controlling the characters.
He's so scripted of his settings.
Okay, very funny, but I want to leave, all right?
I think that's what makes it scary and relatable, because you could imagine it happened to you.
What is this? What is happening to me?
On Nightmares and Dreamscapes, the autopsy room too was really fun.
What is going on here? The snake! Why can't you see that? Please, you can't do this. You can't cut me up. Help me. Don't you realize I can still feel?
One really clear example of that dynamic is Misery. We can all imagine it could happen to us. We are all James Caan's character in that movie, and Kathy Bates is so freaking scary.
Last night it came so clear. I realize you just need more time. Eventually, you'll come to accept the idea of being here. Paul, do you know about the early days at the Kimberley Diamond Mines? Do you know what they did to the native workers who stole diamonds? Don't worry, they didn't kill them.
In the book, Annie Wilkes cuts his foot off with an axe. So we sit down in the first meeting and Rob goes, we can't cut his foot off. There's a myriad of issues with it. So they had pitched this idea of the hobbling. And they broke for lunch and they said, okay, you guys get everything rigged up for lunch, and then when we come back, we'll film it. They all came back from lunch and they're like, well, what are you doing? Like, you're supposed to be ready. I'm like, well, those are the fake legs. So they didn't know because we had disguised his legs so well.
Any for God's
The first screening,
sake.
you could feel the oxygen being sucked out of the theater when she raises the sledgehammer, because everybody at the same time goes, all at once.
Almost done.
You don't even see it in close-up. You see it in wide. You see her lift the sledgehammer, and it's the real sledgehammer, and it's heavy. And then when she swings, and she hits it a second time, you never see it. And you don't need to see it. It's so much about the sound effect. Cut to the close-up, and she's...
God, I love you.
It's when Stephen gets the combination of the humanity along with the situation was terrifying. And they can say it's horror, but I think what Stephen does, and also what I do and what so many of us do, really is suspense. Those are people. I mean, yes, the situation is one of rising dread, but you're looking at people.
The secret is in the casting, and I think that's the same for any role. John Ford used to say it's 70% of the job. You make the right choice and you're more than halfway there.
And the Oscar goes to Kathy Bates in Misery.
Kathy Bates is a brilliant actress. She'd won the Academy Award for Misery.
I'd like to thank William Goldman for bringing the wonderful, crazy Annie Wilkes to the screen, and Stephen King for thinking of her in the first place.
And Misery was a real Stephen King crazy thing, and Kathy Bates was great in the role. Dolores, a very different role. Strong, tough, but nuanced.
I guess you want to know somebody's life. You look at their hands.
The challenge to me, and the thing that was probably most interesting to me, is that Dolores Claiborne is a woman's movie. The three main characters are women. The women rule this movie.
Why go through 20 years of hell? Why, Mother?
I have a friend, Larry Kasdan, who's a great director. His son went to Columbia. During the first semester back at Christmas, I happened to run into them. And Larry's son said, you know, I took this film class, and the teacher was a woman and was trying to communicate the fact that there are no women's stories out there, and that, you know, you need to have filmmakers who understand women. And she was going to show Dolores Claiborne to say Taylor is oftentimes used for men or women, right? And that Taylor Hackford, this woman who had directed Dolores Claiborne, really understands the women in this, the four women that are here. It's a brilliant women's story. And this Larry Kasdan's son said up and said, well, I just want to say I know Taylor Hack, he's a man. No, he's not. No man could make this story. Can I have a better compliment than that? It was great. But it all started with Stephen King. He had the inspiration. Stephen King created the characters.
You better sit back down, Joe, if you don't want this in your head.
Dolores is heroic. How does a mother deal with incest? A lot of them know it and just go along with it. Dolores was not about to ignore it. Dolores understood the horror of what her husband was putting this child through. It had to be repaid, and she did. Which I thought was Stephen King, all Stephen King.
The only thing you're gonna get is a long stretch in Shawshank Prison for child molesting. Goddamn bitch!
I think that Stephen King probably had a Dolores in his life. The way she was described, the way all the women were described, was so real. My mother had a very difficult life, and she still provided for me by working her ass off. When I wrote him, I just said, listen, I see my mother in this character. Stephen King can write women. He really can.
Stephen King has a knack for writing terrific female characters, and I think he would credit a lot of that to his wife, Tabitha, and to her influence on him throughout his life. And a lot of his books, especially his most personal, with some of the most fascinating heroines, are dedicated to Tabitha and her sisters and other women in his life who are very powerful figures. He was raised by a powerful and strong single woman. His relationship with his mother shapes his writing quite a bit, and he goes into very moving detail about that on writing in a lot of his interviews. I think he's a man who grew up in the presence and under the influence of remarkable women, and who married a remarkable woman, who in a lot of ways is responsible for the biggest points of inflection kind of in his career and in his personal life. If you listen to him talk about Tabitha and you realize that she pulled the manuscript of Carrie out of the trash can when he threw it in there in complete despair, when you imagine her being the first set of eyes on one of his stories and giving him that first critical feedback, when you imagine some of the stories he tells about their marriage, not only kind of in his fictionalized versions of it, but on writing, when he talks about how she came to him and made him confront his addiction. It's very easy to see where he gets a lot of that fortitude and kind of nettle that his heroines have. I think he has that at home.
He came from a broken home, as I did. His parents split up early, and he was raised by a single mother, very blue-collar, real hard-scrabble life. And his work is often about the fractured family.
Your family is the place where you're supposed to feel safe. The outside world is the other. Your family is you. And if that starts to crumble, if that starts to present danger and horrifying circumstances to you, you're not safe anywhere. If you can't be safe within the family unit, how can you possibly expect to survive? And I think that theme running through a lot of Stephen King's work is actually what adds to the terror that we feel as we either witness or read these stories.
Whether it's the family in Cujo and what they're going through before the dog actually shows up, or what's happening in The Shining between Jack and Wendy.
First time I encountered Stephen King was through The Shining, the book The Shining. I read that and I was just, blown away. I just thought this was the most amazing thing.
I had to stop reading it. I think I was in a remote lodge in the mountains somewhere. It was very similar to the Colorado wilderness at the hotel in The Shinies, and it really creeped me out.
The book club, by accident, sent me The Shining. I was going to send it back because I didn't have the money to buy it, but I opened the book, and at random, it was the paragraph where the dead woman sits up in the bathtub. And I thought, oh, I have to read this book.
When I read The Shining, I think that's the first time I was enchanted by the voice of the writer. When you go inside Jack Torrance's head, you connect with him in this very visceral way.
Stephen had a time clock in there, which was the boiler down in the basement, which was building and building and building, and of course at the end blew up.
The boiler that eventually blows up, that is a metaphor for what's going on in Jack Torrance's head.
I was hired to direct Nolan's Cadillac. The writer and I, we were going to have a call with Mr. King, and I was just vibrating. I was so excited. And I said, what do you think I should say first? I think I'm going to tell him how much I love The Shining. And he said, I wouldn't do that because he thinks it's a total piece of shit.
It was very well known that Stephen King did not like the Kubrick film. And there are a number of reasons, but one of the foremost is that this was a really personal book to him. It was a book he wrote while he was still drinking about the guilt of a father who, while he's drunk, has broken his beautiful little boy's arm. It's about guilt and seeking redemption. He goes to this location that is completely devoid of people in the hopes that that will help him stay away from the bottle and be a responsible husband and father. And Kubrick turned it into something very different.
I was at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood, first day, first show to see The Shining, and pretty much everybody in that huge theater had read the book. So we're all going, all right, Kubrick's doing it, this is going to be great. And they were booing and hissing, and everybody was like pissed off. It wasn't the book.
The creative personalities of Stanley Kubrick and Stephen King are very, very different. King is a very warm and human and emotional writer, and Kubrick is a very cool and intellectualized filmmaker. Scatman Crothers told me he would do 85 takes of one shot over and over and over and not necessarily give any direction. So his calculating manner is kind of in contrast to the emotional warmth of what King's stories are about.
In his entire body of work, which is substantial and tremendously influential, Kubrick was never an emotional filmmaker.
Oh, come on. What do you mean roll
2
video?
seconds.
We're killing ourselves out here, and you've got to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing
So we
right
play
by
mood
the
music?
door. No, I can't
Yeah, but when you
hear.
came out like this, you said it is.
We're sitting there because they say, wait a minute, and then you say on the radio,
But when you
go.
do it, you've got to look desperate, Shelley. You're just wasting everybody's time now.
I can't even get
Well,
this
bring it
door
down.
open. You have... On the record, I got such a bollocking because they said, turn over, and they said, video rolling and all that, and I got all ready, jumped up and down, and then they said, never mind, cut it.
He had one emotional scene, one, out of all the movies, and that was the very end of Paths of Glory, which will move you to tears. But never again did Stanley Kubrick try to get your emotions involved. It was always cinematically stunning, but it was a very intellectual chess game, him telling a story.
I think we should discuss Danny.
It's a really good Stanley Kubrick movie, but it's a terrible Stephen King movie.
The problem is Stanley Kubrick didn't believe in the supernatural in any way, shape, or form, and the movie was dictated on that belief. So it works on his own logic perfectly. It's just not Stephen King's logic. Kubrick would call him up in the middle of the night and ask things like, do you believe in God?
When I talked to Stephen King, I asked him a lot of questions about The Shining and the shooting of Shining, and he told me this anecdote. He said that he was home sleeping 2 o'clock in the morning or something in Maine, where he lives, and his telephone was ringing, and it was Stanley Kubrick. And he said, "Hi, Stephen, it's Stanley. Are you okay?" And Stephen King said, "Yeah, no, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, so I'm sleeping." "Oh yeah, sorry, I'm here in London. We're shooting away, and I just have one question for you." And Stephen King said, "Yeah, what is it?" And Kubrick said, "Does God exist?" Stephen King said, "Well, Stanley, that's a very big question. That really depends on where you come from, it's a big discussion." And Kubrick said, yeah, no, that's right. Thank you very much. And he put down the phone.
Yes. Back. They're coming around, sir. We're on our way in. Don't let him run. He's liable to run into me. Okay? So, come on! Well, one for Shelley. Shelley, die. Ex-murder kill.
When we meet Jack Torrance, Nicholson's character in the film, he seems to be as mad from the first second we meet him as he is in the last second we meet him. His madness lacks an arc. He seems to be quite unhinged from the very beginning.
David Cronenberg said to me once, right after The Shining came out, that the reason The Shining doesn't work is because they cast the ending. Jack Nicholson's crazy from the beginning. That works in Kubrick's world, but not in King's world.
It will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
I know a famous film critic says that Nicholson's performance in The Shining is both his best and his worst performance, which is an interesting thing of putting it, you know.
What you lose, I think, is, again, the thing that I think is Steven's great strength is the recognizable humanity in all of these characters.
Why don't you start right now and get the fuck out of here?
And who could imagine those two actually ever being married? You lose the horror, to me, of someone very familiar to you becoming so other. That's, to me, that goes to my heart right now. I imagine, you know, if my wife and I had, if suddenly they seemed so different, how painful and difficult that would be. That wasn't in the movie at all.
Yet, as time has gone on, as we've all seen, it has become what, you know, it has become this iconic horror movie that, based on that, I guess King never liked, you know, what he did, but it really was Kubrick's version of King. He had to make it his own, like most artists do. It's always tough to make those adaptation so everybody loves it.
Hollywood is a rough and tumble place. They call it show business, not show friendly. And there's betrayal and treachery and disappointment and all kinds of things. There's a great joke. I think it was Ernest Hemingway who said, when you make a deal with Hollywood, what you must do is drive to the Colorado River, stop on the bridge halfway across between Arizona and California, and throw your novel across. When they throw the money across, then you put it in your car and you drive back east.
You know, the movie went on to become iconic. It's a huge success and everybody knows Here's Johnny. But Stephen King wanted the chance to do something closer to his book. And he himself wrote the screenplay and he asked me if I would do it. Actually, the first question was, if Brian De Palma turns this down, would you want to direct it? Well, I don't know if it ever went to Brian De Palma, but he didn't make it.
Daddy! He did! Hi!
Hey, Danny boy. Danny?
King asked me to because we had had two very successful experiences together. I was very naive. I thought, yeah, I want to do the Stephen King version. I was disappointed in the Kubrick version because I had loved the book so much before I saw it. So I thought, sure, why not? Well, once people started hearing that there was going to be a Shining for television, oh my God, for television, how can that be any good? And being directed by the guy who directed Critters 2, how could that be any good? You know, Stanley Kubrick versus Mick Garris.
All the guests, Mr. Allman.
But the script was wonderful, and I thought, we're going to make something on our own, something special, which we did. You know, it was an opportunity to just tell the story of the book, which was very, very personal to King. We ignored the Kubrick film. There are times when you can't help it, like the Here's Johnny scene. You still have somebody breaking through the door in the bathroom and attacking Wendy. That's the place where it most resembles the Kubrick film. There was another important differentiation too. King was drinking when he wrote the book, and King was dry when he wrote the screenplay for the miniseries.
My name's Hartwell, and I'm an alcoholic with a fondness for tranquilizers. Hi, my name's Jack.
So he was able to give it a new perspective from outside of being someone who was abusing substances.
You won't be sorry.
I was talking to Steve on the phone one day. I had called him just to say, how are you? How's it going? And he said, oh, I think I might be about to make the biggest mistake of my life because I have this story that I'm thinking of writing and then publishing in 6 volumes. And he told me the basic idea, this mentally challenged black inmate who is in for apparently murdering 2 little white girls who turns out to be this miraculous instrument of God.
Your name is John Coffey.
Yes, sir, boss.
It's his relationship with the guards. He didn't think I'd be interested because it was another prison thing. And I said, you know, you're probably right, but that sounds intriguing enough to me. So the next thing I know is I get the very first volume of the 6 sent to me by his agent. I read it, and I did something I've never done before or since, which is I have to make this movie. I don't even know what the rest of it is. I don't even know how it ends, but this is Stephen King at his best. I just could tell. I called his office in Maine, and the person I spoke to said, well, he's not here. He's in Colorado on Mick Garris's set of the Shining miniseries. I did know Mick. He and I were good friends by then. We had sort of a small circle of friends in Los Angeles, you know, all of us involved in the movie business in some way or other. Mick's very good friends with Greg Nicotero, and Greg's very good friends with this guy and that guy and Robert Rodriguez and Quentin and so many of those guys. This was back when I was single and working like a crazy machine. And I would, sometimes on a weekend, I would have everybody come over and just invite, and just, I had this huge table and put like 14 or 16 people around the table and make this giant pot of spaghetti and meat sauce, and we'd open bottles of wine, and we'd be there till 2 or 3 in the morning, just around the table, just talking and laughing. And the rare occasion that he's actually on the West Coast, we did have Stephen King and George Romero, and Mick would be there quite a lot. So I flew to Colorado, and I rented a car, and I drove up the mountain, just like Jack Torrance in the opening of The Shining, and I arrived at the Stanley, this incredible hotel. That was the very hotel that gave Stephen King the idea for The Shining in the first place. I walked into their ballroom, and they were in the middle of filming the big New Year's Eve scene, and there were all these extras dressed as ghosts and ghouls, and Stephen King was up on the stage as the band leader and shaking his butt, and, you know, it was so much fun to walk onto that set. And of course, Mick is a dear friend, so it was like a very welcoming arrival.
Where I really like having friends show up and do cameos, and I didn't know that Frank had an ulterior motive, but it's the only time in his life Frank had ever shaved off his beard. So I didn't ask him to, but he wanted to do it. And so we had all these wonderful people there, especially people within the genre where the fans will see, that's Frank Darabont. And you feel like you're part of a special club because most people don't know who Frank Darabont is, but we do, right?
And Steve saw me and he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I've come all this way to tell you I really want to do the Green Mile. He said, great, it's yours. I said, fantastic. Can I read the rest of it? He said, no, you can't. You have to wait just like everybody else. And then that's when he also admitted that he actually hadn't even written the last volume or 2 of it. And I thought, what a bold, crazy, high wire act that is.
He's an extraordinary writer. It's sort of like the Charles Dickens of 20th and 21st century, you know, literally writing these massive novels, almost in episodes, you know. What a giant.
The Green Mile was his attempt to do Dickens, which is to write an episodic novel where you could publish a new chapter every week or whatever it was, which is how Dickens came to write so many of his novels. That was how they wrote in the 1800s, and they were trying to make a living, and they were paid a penny a word or whatever it was. But that was the Green Mile too.
The movie was set during the Depression at a time, and certainly in a place where black people were not respected at all.
Boy, you under arrest for murder.
That's what I thought was so interesting and powerful about the theme of that story when I read it. What does the Bible speak of? It speaks of the least of these. The least will be the greatest, you know? You have a man who is not even really considered a man. What if that person is actually a miracle of God? What if that is the best of us? And I found that so moving and so powerful. And just the basic theme of don't judge a book by its cover. You don't judge a person by the color of their skin. You don't judge a person by their status in life or in society. It's like what Martin Luther King said, which is you judge somebody by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, not by surface things, you know. Judge them by their actions. And I'm a big believer in that sort of thing.
I want it to be over and done with. I do. I'm tired, boss. Tired of being on the road, lonely as a sparrow in the rain. I'm tired of never having me a buddy to be with, to tell me where we's going to, coming from, or why. Mostly I'm tired of people being ugly to each other.
My favorite memory of The Green Mile is one of my favorite memories from directing, period. There's the scene in The Green Mile where Paul, Tom Hanks, comes into the cell with John Coffey, and they've now realized that he is A, innocent of the crime, and B, that he is this miracle of God. It's the scene that I know got Michael the nomination, right? Shooting that scene, this is an example of what a generous actor Tom Hanks is, and the wisdom of a truly generous actor. Because since Michael was the least experienced actor on the set when we began, I would usually start, shooting a scene with him first, because he would generally get there within a few takes. The same with every actor. They usually have their sweet spot, whether it takes 1 to 3 or it takes 5 to 6 or whatever. As a director, you got to just make a note of that and make sure you don't wear them out by the time they're on camera. And Tom was always very gracious about that. Movie stars aren't always. They usually want to start on them. But he was very cool about me starting on Michael. I remember we started the same way, all on Michael. And Tom was off camera, but he wasn't just giving him the lines. He was acting his heart out for Michael. I was starting to get nervous thinking, I hope Tom still has some gas left in the tank by the time I turn around and get the cameras on him, because he's winning an Academy Award here off camera. But he knew to get the performance that Michael needed to give, he had to give Michael everything as his scene partner. And that wisdom and that generosity, running the risk of not having enough left for yourself, but giving it all to the other actor so that that actor can shine, that's the kind of generosity that Tom has. It's certainly nothing we discussed. He just did it. He just knew he had to do it for Michael. He had to be fully there, 100%. Tom was always on the set, and he being the movie star, we would try to be conscious of the fact that, it's Friday night, you have your weekend coming up, I can let you go. But he's, well, no, we're still doing the scene. I was like, yeah, but I've got all your stuff already. I've shot you. We can have someone stand in for you. Oh, no. He has to be there for the other actors. So Tom would be there sometimes till 2 o'clock in the morning on a Friday. We're now eating into his weekend. He didn't care. He had to be there for the other actors, even off camera.
You know how many times I've been off camera in all the movies I've been?
No. Tom was one of my choices for Andy in Shawshank. He couldn't consider it because he was doing Forrest Gump. Things turned out great, regardless, because Tim Robbins is brilliant and so is Morgan Freeman. So, any other thoughts we had don't matter. We got the right guys for that. But because of Shawshank and because of the way the movie turned out, Tom approached me and said, wow, I love the movies you make. If you ever want me to read anything, let me know. So the very next thing was The Green Mile. So I sent it straight to Tom, and he read it and said, great, let's do it. And it was the easiest yes I ever got from an actor. And he was actually, I would say, probably the easiest person to work with in my career.
Michael Clark Duncan. Thanks for your time.
I came home one day, I clicked the messages, and there's Bruce Willis on my answering machine saying, hey, I hear you're doing this movie. I've read the book. I really love the book. You should read Michael Clark Duncan, a guy I'm working with on Armageddon. he's your guy. Like, okay, Bruce, I'll give him a try. I'll have him in to read. His first audition for me, you thought, no way. No way. And then he became the only way. Bruce was right, as it turns out, and I've never heard from Bruce Willis since. This is the only time. It's one of those weird, surreal moments you have sometimes in our business where you go, "There's Bruce Willis on my answering machine." That's kind of great. That's kind of cool. It's pretty funny, but no, he was right. Michael was the guy.
We had the little girl bodies that we had made. The dummies were sculpted to make John Coffey look larger. He was a very tall actor to begin with, but we sort of scaled them down a little bit. And for some reason or another, the first time they filmed it, the dummies weren't positioned in the way that they were sculpted. We were editing the movie, and Frank had said, there's just one thing that I want to take a second stab at. And we rebuilt the dummies of the two little girls, and we reshot it on the backlot at Warner Studios, and it made a world of difference. People don't realize what it takes to make a movie. In every single element, you have to make a decision. Do you like that belt? What about the color of that shirt? How does the sun look? Do we want this in the background? And you have to have an answer for every one of those questions. And you get hit as the director from the second you step on set to the second you go home.
I'm in heaven, and my heart beats so that I can hardly speak, and I seem to find the happiness I seek when we're out together dancing cheek to cheek.
There was something about the musicals that Hollywood was making during the Depression when the circumstances of real life were so dire, but the musicals were this glossy, sort of unattainable, like heaven vision. And that particular number has always struck me in such a delightful way because it's Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. They're the most iconic musical performers and dancers of that era. And they are singing about heaven. It just felt like the right anchor for the movie. In Steve's story, it was Killer's Kiss, with Richard Widmark playing some crazy killer that made our main character, Paul, think of the events of long ago, because that character reminded him of Percy. It didn't feel like quite the right thing to me. I wanted the contrast, I think, between the reality of that time versus the dream reality that Hollywood was telling us. And I wanted it to remind him of John Coffey and not of Percy when he was watching that clip and being transported by something he'd never seen before. And they're singing about being in heaven. I thought, okay, that seems really right to me. I couldn't quite picture the scene with John Coffey watching Richard Widmark pushing some lady down the stairs in a wheelchair and giggling because he's murdered her. And I didn't see that having a great effect on John Coffey. That's one of those things that when you're translating from one language to another language, from written storytelling to cinema storytelling, that evolve along the way, that change along the way. It's like, what do I want the audience to feel when they're watching this scene?
Frank and I have been friends for decades, and when it came time to shoot The Green Mile, we knew that the big moment would be Dell's death and the electrocution in the chair. And we worked with Daryl Pritchett, who was the special effects coordinator, and we knew that first and foremost, whatever we built, whatever this puppet was that was going to be built, needed to move 100% realistically. So we had Michael Jeter, the actor, come to our studio in the chair, and we filmed his movements. We filmed how he would move and how he would react, and we sort of reverse engineered the puppet to match what the actor had done, which traditionally you don't usually do it that way. The puppet, the puppet does what it's going to do, what it's built to do. But in that particular instance, it was really, really important that it felt 100% real. Michael came to the studio, we recorded all of his movements, and then at that point, we did a body cast of him. We built a fiberglass body that the puppeteer rods and controls and cables went out the bottom of the chair and through the back wall. So when we were shooting the scene, all the puppeteers were behind the wall. So we couldn't see anything because we weren't in the room with Tom Hanks and all the other actors. We were on the other side of the wall, so we had a little monitor there. Steve was there when we shot that sequence.
We have Stephen King visiting the set of The Green Mile.
Hey, how you doing? Come on.
How are you people?
Okay.
Tubuous, Frank. Isn't this Mile the way you pictured it?
Yeah.
Sure it is. Well, we're about to roll.
Watch the magic.
Cut. Come on. Frank, you man. We're definitely gonna do it.
There is no better man.
That's great. Let me show you old Sparky, man. We fried him, bastards.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I would. Check this out, man. Is this ever creepy?
Oh, yeah.
Look at this. Check it out.
And then we strap the ankles. It'd be sort of like a Houdini thing if you could pull it off. That's exactly it.
Exactly.
This is a good look for you.
It's a good look for me. Yeah.
It is.
Frank, could I get out now?
Stephen King showed up on the set. It was his birthday. We brought out a cake. We all sang happy birthday to him.
We do have a secret evil plan for Stephen King. Since last Monday was his birthday, we're going to spring a birthday cake on him.
Oh, God! You like me! You really, really like me!
We pulled it off. Success. I think we really surprised him.
Edouard Delacroix, you are history. Everybody saying happy birthday in the theater. Yeah. God bless you. Thank you. Frank, when's your birthday?
January 28th.
Good. Be prepared.
So excited to have him.
Give my best to everybody.
All right. Take care, man. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Gosh, it could have all been taken away.
In something eerily familiar from his book, Stephen King was hit by a truck as he walked along an empty road.
He's in Maine, he's walking his dog, and then, typical Stephen King, tragedy strikes. He's in this horrible accident.
We were all afraid after that accident that that was going to be it.
It's miraculous that he came out of it alive and now fully ambulatory. That's just amazing to me. So, thanking God for that. That whole accident is actually very much connected to the Green Mile. When we had our big premiere screening in Westwood, it was the first time Stephen King had made an appearance in public since his accident. In a lot of pain still, but he was very invested emotionally in the movie, and he really wanted to be there. He really wanted to see it. So that was his first time out, after that.
Clients that holds the pins, that hold the bones together.
Own Home Shopping Network now. Operators are standing by. Use Tootie. Humor and drugs, the two things together.
And bitching. A lot of bitching.
Yeah, big time.
King is a believer. Steve had often talked about life goes on after the story ends. I am not a religious person by any stretch of the imagination, but religion and belief are not the same thing. Religion is often used to control, not to give comfort.
King does touch and use politics, social issues, cultural issues, and religion in a lot of his work. It's woven through it. It's one of his elements, I guess we could call it, motifs. Children of the Corn is no different. When I saw this script, I realized that this script is based on an exploration of dogma. how people follow other people, how cults work, why belief systems are what they are, and how people manipulate others.
It's really ingrained in American culture. Even if we're not religious, we've grown up with religion from childhood. Most kids go to church in their early years, and maybe they grow out of it, or maybe they never go. But it's something that's always around you.
In the late 1980s, my parents, who were Methodist at that time, became Southern Baptists. And all of a sudden, a lot of the things that I had loved were off limits. For that intense period of time, I sort of lived in Fahrenheit 451 in my house. I had to hide Stephen King books under my bed in the box springs under my bed, and they did at one time find kind of my stash of Stephen King books under the bed, and they burned them in our fireplace. I wrote Stephen King a letter after my books had been burned. I just put Stephen King, Bangor, Maine, and I sent him the first 3 Dark Tower books. I had read that if you sent Stephen King a book, he'd sign it for you. I didn't expect anything. I wasn't even sure it would get there, but a couple weeks later, I came home from the private Christian school that I went to every day. My dad pulled me aside and he was like, "Josh, there's a box here from Stephen King. I didn't tell your mom." King had written me, you know, this beautiful message kind of in the front cover of each of the books, and it was a continuing letter. So you'd start reading one and then the next one would pick up. I couldn't imagine that my mom was burning The Stand in our fireplace because it's the most Christian book he's ever written. You know, I was raised by people who believed the Antichrist was coming at some point, that the rapture was going to happen. Stephen King gave me a counter myth that allowed me to look at some of this stuff in a different way.
I'm seeing a lot of Army traffic on State 17 westbound in the direction of Arnett. You heard anything about that?
Just you let the Army mind their business and you mind yours, Unit 16. Bye.
Politics is something that King doesn't shy away from, and neither do I. The whole military-industrial complex. The military thinks they're right and they can do whatever the hell they want to do. Well, that's not why they're there. They're there for protecting us, not controlling us.
The idea that civilization and society is a very fragile construct and it can fall apart at the drop of a hat is very appealing to me, because if you are a student of history, you can see that that has happened many, many times in many, many ways. Entire nations can go insane, and everything that we depend upon, especially more and more, it's so very technological that if you pull the rug out from under us, we revert to a very primitive state.
You don't seem to understand the situation here, ma'am. Martial law has been declared. We don't have to put up with you and your pinko friends anymore.
Mike, are you getting all this?
Get him! Get him! Get the driver!
You know, The Stand shines a light on what America is as a nation. You know, when all the societal norms break down, who are they?
Yeats was right. Things fall apart.
And here we are at this moment, seeing societal norms break down, and it's not pretty. It's terrifying.
Bring out your dead! The monster's coming! He's coming! Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
Just the idea of what would you do if, like, everyone was dead and there was just this handful of people. I hadn't seen many stories like that. Now, it seems like maybe every story is about that. But back then, seeing the Stand miniseries, that was the first time I thought, oh my God, imagine if I survived something like that and you could go into a supermarket and no one was there and there's a town and everyone's dead. Like, it was just so mind-blowing to me as a little kid.
I really didn't want to do The Stand again linear because mixed series meant so much to me when I was a kid. I don't know what reason there is to make that again. We had to do some things too just to make it more representative of all of America, because if everybody in the world died, you don't just want to see a poster with a bunch of white people and one old black lady. Because, you know, in the book, it's like it is everybody's white except for Mother Abigail. It was written 40 years ago, before I was even born. So we really did try to do what we could to make it be, if the world ended, this is a cross-section of all the people. And then just trying to structure it in a way that would be surprising to people who were really familiar with the material, who'd seen the series many times when they were young or read the book, you know? We wanted to make sure that even if you'd read the book, you never would quite know where it was going to go next and all that.
The irony of that was not lost upon us. While we were shooting, we were, at the very last day, shut down by the COVID pandemic. And of course, The Stand begins with a global pandemic that kills 90% of the population of the world. So it was truly unnerving while we were shooting, seeing how the disease was spreading.
It was strange, it was surreal, and it's still surreal now, you know? But I mean, yes, we absolutely were making a show about what was happening in the world, and that was weird. That man has had a crystal ball for a very long time on his desk. He's just like, show me the future.
That's the legend of Stephen King, is able to see things in the future that the average person can't.
And then also the fact that Randall Flagg, the villain, and has uncomfortable echoes of Donald Trump.
First we drown the rats, and then we burn the witch.
In the way that he appeals to the worst of the American character and is a kind of populist leader in a world in crisis. I really felt when we were making that miniseries, we were holding up a mirror to the world. And when you consider that Stephen King wrote that book sometime in the late 70s, you know, you kind of have to think he's a bit of a prophet.
I think it's that aspect of his work that I like the most, is this deep, sort of resonant understanding of what the moment are that we're living in. And in some ways, the cell had some reflections of that. There was things in the book that I felt were prophetic. The signal isn't something that might happen tomorrow. It happened already. This isn't like it's coming. This is about what's here. Even in the last image of the film, there's the initials of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was not on the landscape at that time.
He's a, prophet of the apocalypse.
So you saw all this shit coming?
That and Rick Stilson in The Dead Zone are just chilling. What he saw coming is, unfortunately, precisely accurate. And here we are.
Bastard! You're not the voice of the people. I am the voice of the people. The people speak through me, not you. It came to me while I slept, Sonny. My destiny. In the middle of the night, it came to me. I must get up now, right now, and fulfill my destiny.
The Dead Zone, remains my favorite of all of King's movies because Christopher Walken's character, the love story, all that wove through that thing was just incredible to me. It really, really captured it.
When HBO started on television here, they had 5 movies and they would play them over and over again. So I watched The Dead Zone probably 100 times. And I just think it's one of the great love stories, one of the great performances by Christopher Walken. Just a terrific film.
They like to use this as a shortcut to school.
And I came to really feel like Stephen King, in a way like Bob Dylan, is a sort of dreamer of America. Like he contains the entirety of it and sort of dreams in the language of the chaos of America.
People, when you apply fear, turn against one another. Paranoia, suspicion, aggression suddenly happens. The veneer of polite civilization gets ripped away very quickly.
And it is his fault. Yes, it is your...
We're dealing with a lot of craziness these days, and it's actually only been getting worse since I made The Mist.
People trying to control an environment and trying to control a population. And here it's done in a very claustrophobic sense. Everybody is trapped together in this one store that's being invaded by monsters. So politics has to go out the window at one point. And it's got the grimmest ending ever, and it's an ending that Darabont came up with.
Frank would always send me an early draft of the script. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think. He had done it with Shawshank. He had done it with Green Mile. He'd done it with Majestic. All of his movies, he would always send me one. And he sent me The Mist, and I read the script, and it got to the end. And I threw the script across the room, and I called Frank. I'm like, dude, really?
Stephen's a genius when it comes to putting you in the skin of those characters. And then when I got to the end of the story, I went, what, there's no ending? It was a very ambiguous kind of non-ending. And I thought, well, okay, that's fine. He's taken me on this incredible journey as a writer, as a storyteller. Fair enough, if he doesn't have a conclusive ending, that's okay. But I thought, if it's a movie, I don't think that's an ending that's going to be very satisfactory. I don't think it's going to really land well. Movies, I think, need an ending. when I wrote the script, I sent it to Stephen King, and my note was, Steve, I gave it an ending, and it's definitely a left turn, and I'm leaving this up to you.
The irony is, when we went to the premiere in New York, Steve basically said, I wish I would have thought of that ending for the book. Because if I would have thought of that, that's how I would have ended the story. It's a unique situation where the writer looks at the body of work of what that movie was and where Frank took it and was like, dang, I wish I would have thought of that. That's pretty great. And I feel like The Mist lives in the same world as John Carpenter's The Thing, where the movie came out right after E.T. and people had a very unique reaction to The Thing. And then the movie has come to be very well respected. I think The Mist is the same way. Upon multiple viewings and as that movie ages, it's like wine. I think people really respect it and understand it and get a much better sense of it.
Just like being home in LA.
Yeah! And to the war!
So when I read The Mist, Steve's story, I thought, oh, this is really cool. This is very weird pressure cooker happening. You take all that and put it into the microcosm of a supermarket, as Steve King did, and you can hold that mirror up to the audience and say, boy, look at this. This is kind of ugly, you know? And I love when stories can do that. I love when a piece of cinema holds that mirror up, whether it's something truly glorious like Schindler's List, which I think is just about the greatest movie ever made, or Night of the Living Dead on the opposite end of the budget spectrum. You know, that also had a very sociological component to it. I don't think they even intended it, but it showed up in the movie, and that's one of the reasons the movie is so powerful and so beloved. I mean, well, we could talk about movies that I love for days, but, you know, Night of the Living Dead, that was in the 60s, in the 1960s, when we were having the civil rights struggle, which we seem to be reliving now, which is really crazy. You would think that we would have grown up more by now, but apparently we don't learn from the past. I believe 1968 was when that movie came out. The civil rights struggle was going on, and the lead of the movie was a black man who was not shy about standing up for himself.
It is tough for the kid. That old man is so stupid. Now, you get the hell down in the cellar. You can be the boss down there. I'm boss up here.
To see black slap a white guy around on screen back then was sociologically earth-shattering. It was amazing. It was like Sidney Poitier in The Heat of the Night, you know. If you really understand what was going on in the United States at the time that Night of the Living Dead came out, you'll realize what a bold movie that really was.
George Romero came from a documentary style background. They made Night of the Living Dead for literally no money. At the time, a lot of the directors really had this unique sort of renegade spirit. Between George and Tobe Hooper and Wes Craven, a lot of the filmmakers at the time, horror was very, very taboo. George always would claim that he never really was trying to make a statement, but he always did. He was able to shine the spotlight on specific elements of what was relevant during the day without ever even realizing, I think, that he had done it. You know, he cast Dwayne Jones, an African-American man, and George would always say, oh, he just was the best actor, which is probably the case, but whether or not George meant it, I always felt that maybe in the back of his mind that there was something there, because then from all of his other subsequent movies from that point on, there was a strong African-American lead and a female. George liked pushing the boundaries, and I think that's where he had a kindred spirit with Steve King.
He and Steven met. Steve, being a fan of George's, wanted to meet George.
I think it may have been during Dawn of the Dead that Steve and George struck up a friendship, and that carried through into Night Riders, and Night Riders Stephen King has a cameo.
Acrobats, that's all. Like the wrestlers on TV. I got the blood
And I believe that it was during Night Riders that they started talking about EC Comics and like wanting to do a movie together, and it ended up being Creepshow.
Hey, buddy! What the fuck happened?
Looks like a hit and run.
Yeah? Looks like a black guy, huh?
Number one, most most important thing about Creepshow is every story had a different tone. One of them was funny. The Jordy Verrill story that Steve starred in was very silly and very outrageous. And then you had The Crate, which was a straight horror. And then you had things like Father's Day.
I got my king.
Every single story was different. So that was one of the main things that I took away from Creepshow when I was younger, and what I wanted to instill in the current iteration of Creepshow, which is you're going on a different journey every single time. And it might be fun, it might be scary, it might be suspenseful, it might be tense, it might be ridiculous, but no matter what, every experience that you go on in the show, you're getting a different vibe from it.
If there was one of those stories that really had a major impact, it was probably They're Creeping Up on You. To live with cockroaches for 4 or 5 weeks was a life-changing experience. We would find them on us all the time, no matter how much we tried to wrap ourselves up and not take them home with us. The roach wranglers, that's what we called them, roach wranglers, promised us that they could actually control the behavior of the roaches with certain Skinnerian or Pavlovian tricks. It's like, no. A roach does not take direction, right? So we had the big dump. We had to dump all the roaches and they would scatter everywhere. And if you've seen the movie, you know that it's when E.G. Marshall finally gets his. So they said, well, how are we going to prevent them from getting out of here? Because the set heights, no ceiling. Oh no, don't worry about it. What we'll do is we'll put Vaseline all around the top of the set so that when they scatter, because they hate light, they'll go up the walls, they'll hit the Vaseline, and they'll fall back down. Okay, we'll take your word for it. So the day comes, Vaseline all around the top of the set. Dump the roaches into the set, and off they go. Right up the wall, over the Vaseline, and out into the rest of the world. The Vaseline didn't work.
I don't know how I came up with it. There are times when I wish I hadn't. Like now.
I'm sure some people in the surrounding area woke up with certain roaches that they'd never seen before. These were big, fat Trinidadian roaches, and I think there are a few new species in western Pennsylvania now.
It was an accident, a legitimate accident. So why should I fuck up my life, right?
How you doing, lady? Thanks for the ride.
One of the things that both Steve and George had is the ability to mix the humor with the horror. Now, of course, Creepshow's the perfect example of that.
That was kind of the beginning of their working relationship, and it was a very unique one because King trusted George. He trusted him implicitly, and that was something that back in the day was very hard to come by. So George was set to direct Pet Sematary at one point, and then of course George did The Dark Half, and he's collaborated with Stephen King probably as many times as Rob Reiner or Frank Darabont. They had really very successful collaborations. But George always was sort of ahead of his time, very much like Steve's writing was.
I think everybody loves to be scared. I think it's a way of working things out. I mean, after all, horror is as ancient as human beings. In all storytelling, in all cultures, there is horror story. Fairy tales were a way for people to teach their children about the real world. But I think a good horror movie allows us to put some order to the chaos.
I'm interested in fear because all my life I've been a fearful person.
Cujo.
I've wasted so much of my life being afraid of imaginary things, afraid I'm not going to get that job, afraid I'll lose the job I have, afraid that I'm not going to meet the girl I love or she's going to leave me once I do find her. All those fears, none of them has ever come true in my life, but I had them anyway. So I felt, well, that's a really interesting topic. And that's what this story in Cujo gives me an opportunity to tell. The dog becomes the metaphor for the insanity that fear people.
You know, obviously, a lot of it's about mortality. A lot of it's about death. A lot of it's about questions of existence and meaning. So under cover of almost silliness, you can tangle with some pretty deep existential questions, I think, is one of the reasons I think horror is super interesting.
Creative and has great concepts. You could take something like A Killer Car and make it a very scary story, but I think the thing that's scarier about something like Christine is the journey that Arnie Cunningham is going through.
You care more about that car than you care about me.
Where really the car, everything is just a metaphor for the change he's going through, being bullied in high school and kind of being an outcast and then trying to find his voice. And I would say that's the thing, at least for me, that makes his work so memorable, that these stories don't leave my brain, is because the people in them and the journeys they go through is always, for me, more visceral and stronger. For me, that is always more powerful than even like supernatural aspects of it.
Decided to wake up and see what home looks like, huh?
In our opinion, Pet Sematary is one of the scariest things he's ever done.
Ellie, be careful! Ellie!
He himself wrote the book and then was so disturbed by what he did, he put it in a drawer for like a year. He knew he'd tap into something because he had kids at that time.
You got it. Gage is flying it. You got it?
Can I fly it now? In a minute, honey.
Yeah, and I have a son now. And so to me, the thought of anything happening to him is the scariest thing I could possibly imagine.
Don't let him go on the road, Lord!
Get him, Lewis! Get the baby!
More heart-rendering than a parent who want to bring their dead child back.
I should never have shown you that place. Your child is not the only thing that will come back.
One of the great themes of horror, be careful what you wish for.
Did you weigh yourself?
297.
Billy, you were 297 last week.
Well, it takes some time for these diets to work.
For Billy Halleck, life is sweet.
I thought Thinner was a terrific character study. I thought it was elevated from being pure horror. I thought there was something very human and very universal about a fat man who wanted desperately to lose weight and finally had his wish answered. It's a universal theme. If everybody isn't trying to lose weight, they know somebody who is. Nobody was ever too thin or too rich. I cast Stephen in it, and he was very good, actually. And he was sitting on set waiting to be called, and he was reading the Bangor newspaper. And I looked over his shoulder to see what he was reading, and Stephen King was reading the obituaries, and which I thought was, very telling.
I think you'd better come along with me, Reverend.
King is always after deeper things. He's willing to look into the darkness completely and allow what emerges, and he's not interested in shutting anything out.
It's an ass kicker, isn't it?
Is that for me?
I found some of those original scripts that he wrote for movies back then that people sort of crapped on at the time. I think Silver Bullet's actually really beautiful and is a really great love story about a brother and a sister and a family and one of the best uncles you could ever meet. In a kid who's in a really interesting situation where he gave him almost a superpower. He gave an identity and a voice to people who had problems that most fiction would never touch. For people with disabilities, for people with mental health issues. I just think all that stuff he's been so brilliant at. And some people look back now and it might be dated, but he broke new ground really in a lot of ways. He did it over the whole course of his career from African Americans back then, who would never be featured in a book in that way, where he had balls and he did it. He has empathy for everyone.
What I interpreted the film to be about is about woundedness. We all as human beings carry some sort of wound. what we are called upon to do is to accept life, to embrace it, and to go forward. And Corey just was a kid who just seemed like nothing could bother. So I thought the werewolf was a beautiful metaphor for what human beings can become if they can't embrace their full nature.
But it's not my fault!
The Reverend, he had lustful impulses, for example. Instead of being able to accept them, he suppressed them so far below the surface that they came out in these monstrous ways.
Every single time Stephen King created characters that I could relate to.
He taps into his subconscious and gets at truths that are not necessarily apparent to everybody else about where we are as a country and a culture.
Stephen King has such an incalculable reach on popular culture in ways that I don't think can ever be measured.
He's the guy who married American pop culture to horror.
Great stories translate from page to celluloid, and there's so many references. Everywhere you look, there's Stephen King references.
Have gun, will travel, reads the card of a man.
I've heard people refer to big dogs as Cujo. Down Cujo. So it's fun to have worked on a film, the title of which has entered the language as Big Dangerous Dog.
He's been such a mirror for pop culture, but now he is his own pop culture.
Stephen King helped define so many of the what now are cliches and tropes of the cinematic world. You see it parodied even. That's when you kind of know you've done something special, whether in literature or in filmmaking or both in this case with Stephen King adaptations.
Oh, come on!
Films like Shawshank Redemption, that classic narration by Morgan Freeman, it is used as a trope now, as a cliche.
It did feel like a prison. And that meant only one thing made sense conceptually. We had to break out. And someone with the gravitas of Morgan Freeman had to narrate it.
The same thing can be said for The Shining. Like, that film in itself is now, like, almost in its entirety is a trope.
I had a couple of people that actually worked on The Shining, working on Fortin Riot, and both films being about writers in hotel room and so on, which was, you know, to me kind of cool and inspiring, being at the same studio where the great Kubrick shot his great movie. In the end of the film, the hotel room is on fire. The fire guys is coming to break down the door and to get Enslin out of the room. And the prop guy came up to me just before we shot the scene and said, you know, I worked in The Shining as well, and this is actually the axe that we used in The Shining, the famous axe that Jack Nicholson have when he breaks down the door. And I was thinking, you know, maybe you want to use it for this scene. And I was like, fantastic, absolutely. So I gave the axe to the fire guy who breaks down the door and helps out Enslin from the hotel room. Nobody knows that, obviously. Now you know it, but it's a secret. But that's Nicholson's axe. And to me, that was a cool detail.
You can see The Shining in just about every successful horror film made in the last 25 years. And sometimes in the tiniest little ways. But I think we filmmakers want to kind of express our love for that material, and so it feeds itself, and then that becomes this kind of self-perpetuating cycle of references, homage, and celebration.
Well, hi there.
When I read Dr. Sleep, as a fan of Kubrick and as a fan of King, I was fascinated by the tug of war that was happening internally. I'm reading this great story, but all of the visual language in my brain is Kubrick's. It just is.
Danny! Danny boy!
Oh, no, Doc. You can put things from the Overlook away in boxes, but not memories. Never those. They're the real ghosts.
I had a fateful meeting with John Berg at Warner Brothers, and he was a Stephen King fan. And I just finished Gerald's Game, and no one had seen it yet. And he asked how it went. He was like, "That's a crazy one, you know, hard one to crack." And I said, "Yep, it was really difficult, but I think we might have done it." And he said, "We have one that's really hard to crack. Have you ever read Dr. Sleep?" And I was like, "Yes." And he said, "Out of curiosity, what would you recommend?" And the pitch I gave him was, I was like, I think what you do is you stay as close to the book as you can for the first 2/3, but you have to assume that story takes place in the established Kubrick cinematic universe. It's too well known, it's too iconic. If you try to come off of it, it'll backfire.
Mike Flanagan really had to walk a tightrope because he knew that King was not a fan of the Kubrick film, but he also knew that most audiences know The Shining from the Kubrick film and not from the book.
What if you could take Stephen King's Shining and Stanley Kubrick's Shining, and what if you could just kind of parent trap them back together? Is it possible? I decided going into it that if King didn't like anything that I was up to, that I wouldn't do the movie. His initial answer to the idea of using the Kubrick canon was no. He didn't want to do it, but wanted to have a creative conversation. The pitch that I made was all about one scene. I said, if you can just imagine, Dan goes back into the condemned overlook, and it's all dormant, it's all asleep, and he has to wake it up. And he makes it to the gold room, and at the bar is a glass waiting for him, because Dan is 8 years sober at that point. And there's a man in the familiar Kubrick red tuxedo pouring the whiskey for Dan. And imagine that that man is his father. And the two of them have a conversation about alcohol. That was what turned him around.
This is the medicine. So tell me, pup, are you gonna take your medicine?
I'm not. Adaptation is complicated because very bold choices have to be made. There's no way you can translate 600 pages of a book into a screenplay and keep everything.
Rewrite Stephen King. It really doesn't make sense when you think about it. You know, why do a Stephen King movie and not have Stephen King's story? You know, why buy a book if you're not going to follow it?
It's always about what you don't do, what you can't do. You have to have a strategy about what you're not going to do. So I come to it as a reader, and I want to recreate the experience that the reader has, the emotional experience, not the plot detail.
Stephen had a very cool phrase when people would say, well, what do you think of what they've done to your books? He'd say, well, what do you mean, what have they done to my books? Well, look at the bookshelf. My books are all there. Nobody's done anything to my books. So I think he has a really great attitude about how his books are adapted.
A novel is not a film. It isn't. You know, sometimes it's working with the dialogue in the head or narration or all the things. You've got to make a film that an audience can look at, find themselves in, and at the same time, be true to the original story. That calls for the actual term, adaptation. And I think that you have to be bold in the sense of staying true to material, but also being bold about adapting it so that it fits on the screen, not on the page.
Movies are what you see and what you hear, but as Hitchcock said, they're called moving pictures, not talking pictures. Movies are still a visual medium.
Writing a screenplay is a very interesting process. It's half mechanics and half poetry. When you're adapting, a great author, you know, if the story is excellent, what you're trying to do is capture the essence of it. Even if you're changing certain facts and, you know, moving the plugs around and, you know, sawing the wood a little bit differently, it still feels like they experienced the same emotions and the same story by the end of it.
Everybody has their own way to approach material, but it doesn't matter whether it's Stephen King or not, but the thing about Stephen King, it usually works really well for the screen.
The reason any filmmaker wants to adapt Stephen King is the material is so good. He's all about character, all about story. And where he keeps coming up with these, I have no idea. The man is so prolific.
I can't believe how much he's written, how much he's produced, and how good it is. I don't know where that comes from. Nobody does, otherwise they'd bottle it and sell it.
He believes that like these stories already exist. They're already out there. And like he says it all the time because people think he's joking. He's not joking. This is what he believes, that the stories are just out there and he's just like an archaeologist just digging around until he finds something, and then he just starts excavating it, extracting it, and pulling from it, and revealing it. Michelangelo, the great sculptor, he said something extremely similar, that every block of marble has the masterpiece in it.
He takes a big idea and he turns it and he turns it and he turns it, and that's why the book keeps going and going and going, because he keeps taking this one idea and he doesn't stick with what it meant on chapter 1. Stephen also has a great look, which helps to look like who you are. You know, I think that he looks like who he is, and a lot. So the second you see him, he could only be him. It's a very admirable quality, I think, to look like who you are.
I wouldn't go out there if I were you.
I think I'll be all right.
Told you. They never listen.
Of course, It Chapter 2, Dr. Sleep, The Stand.
The Outsider on HBO starts in January.
And then you're working on something with J.J. Abrams, too.
Now wait, I'm not done.
I would guess that he's as shocked as everybody else about this resurgence.
Mr. Mercedes starts tonight on DirecTV.
Well, I'm not really sure what happened, but there we were, just smack bang in the middle of the, as I call it, the King Naissance. Like it was an explosion, and then the rest is history.
Suddenly, every studio that had a Stephen King property sitting on their shelf, they wanted to get it made. And we sort of like tentatively raised our hand.
A movie that we would have done for free. It was just something indelible in our childhood.
Some of the series have been inspired by his work. Stranger Things, which kind of sounds like Needful Things. Certainly you have to give Stephen a big nod of thanks for sort of inventing the weird 80s supernatural adventure story that often stars kids.
The way digital technology has improved over the last decade has made it easier and easier for people to realize in a fairly realistic way some of the more spectacular things that Stephen King has been writing about.
I love that he'll go out and do anything. As I said, you know, you could give him an orange and he could write a novel about it. He wrote about the Kennedy assassination and time travel and basically anything he wants to. He's a writer that knows no bounds.
Cable and streaming have really helped that along. TV matured to the point where TV can be novelistic. Sitting down in front of the television and being able to watch 10 or 12 hours of a great story. It's wonderful. It didn't exist not that long ago.
I think the other reason that he's timeless is because he's also completely contemporary. He's not a novelist that takes 10 years to write a book. He's writing, he's writing, he's writing, he's writing. And speed, I think, gives him this, he's alive in the moment.
Different generation of directors and different approaches, but still the essence of Stephen King's work is in there.
He shows us a mirror of where we are as people, and even though the symptoms of how we behave change as the ages change and the years go by, he keeps his basic humanity in his stories.
His stuff doesn't really age. Like he was writing about the darkness that lurks in the heart of America, and that darkness, sadly, has not dissipated.
His stories are about the human condition, so it doesn't matter whether you're my age. Those themes resonate, and every generation can find those themes.
And within that, we find deep truths that we didn't see before, that are things we need to know about what's happening right now. I think that's his genius.
Stephen King is just one of the rare careers I don't think anyone's going to ever come along again that has this kind of body of work and still continue. I think he's like a clown car.
This is your 61st book. Do you have a target number of books you're going for? Is there a certain point at which like you will stop? Is retirement in any way an option for you?
God will tell me when to retire. He'll say, get out of the game, hang up your jock, you're done.